a lot of people don't really know about it, I guess, that omega-3 is not built by the fish themselves, but they get the omega-3 by eating algae.
So breakfast, lunch and dinner then for you, is it?
Yeah, usually it's 2 out of 3 meals, I'd say, per day.
Really? Crikey me.
Ocean Calls.
Hello and welcome to Ocean Calls, the podcast in which we plunge into the issues making waves on our blue planet. I'm Euronews science reporter Jeremy Wiks, and in today's episode we're talking about the green, slimy stuff that you step over on the beach, the wonder food that will make you happy and healthy, and the answer to all kinds of environmental problems, from carbon capture to overfishing. I'm talking about seaweed, of course, and whether you and I should be eating a lot more of it. Seaweed production in Europe is a minnow in the ocean of Asian producers. Europe farms a few thousand tonnes of seaweed per year compared to tens of millions of tonnes in Asia. But is European seaweed production and consumption poised for a breakthrough? Should we be eating more of it? To discuss this issue, I'm joined by Simon Johansson, the CEO of Nordic Sea Farm, which is at the forefront of seaweed cultivation in the cold, nutrient-rich waters around Sweden. Hi, Simon.
Hello there. Happy to be here.
And Anna Siedler, a marine policy officer at Seas at Risk, an association of environmental organisations. Anna recently published a paper on how algae could be a sustainable alternative to current aquatic food systems. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
Nice to see you. Now, I come from South Wales, where we actually have a tradition of eating seaweed, where it kind of gets boiled up and turned into this something that's a little bit like tinned spinach. It's called lava bread. It's all right, but it's not enormously popular, to be absolutely honest. It's kind of a delicacy you might find in a smart restaurant, or that you might have very occasionally with your grandparents, I suppose. But do you eat seaweed a lot, and how do you eat it? Let's come to Simon first. I'm guessing the answer is yes.
The answer is yes, of course. You have to eat what you cultivate, right? But it's a matter of knowledge and inspiration, I would say. If you know what to do with it, how to cook it, it can be really tasty and delicious. And also compared, and depending on what kind of seaweed that you cook with. We grow sugar kelp and sea lettuce, and it was actually featured on the Nobel Prize dinner this winter. So you can do a lot with it, and the King of Sweden ate it, right? And he looked quite happy in the TV.
Yeah, I guess so. So breakfast, lunch and dinner then for you, is it?
Yeah, usually it's 2 out of 3 meals, I'd say, per day.
Really? Crikey me. Anna, let's to hear from you.
Yes, I have to admit I don't eat seaweed that regularly, but I have to say during my research, I really got some taste for it and I really got interested. And I was also wondering why we don't eat more, because it's such a fascinating food source. And I mean, I get into contact a bit more when you travel to Asia, or if you have sushi. That's, I think, the first starting point for many Europeans. Yeah. But in Germany, it doesn't really have a culture so far. Yeah. So, I'm trying my best to level this up a bit. But I'm interested to hear any recipes from Simon as well.
Yeah, because I've had it kind of pickled, right? And I think I had it in Asia, and that was rather nice. And Simon actually talked about pickled and having it with a glass of beer, which sounds marvellous. But what are the big sort of seaweed eating countries in Europe? Is there anywhere where people really eat this stuff a lot?
I would say France is one of the 4 leading countries in Europe, in Brittany, where they have harvested and grown seaweed for many, many years. I would say 50, 60 years, and it's really part of the local cuisine. But in Europe, but of course, if you look at Asia, as Anna mentioned, it's really part of the daily cuisine there. But in Europe, we actually eat more seaweed than we think. When we eat, for example, sushi, you have the green wakame salad, for example. You have the nori around the sushi. It's all seaweed, right? So many people eat more than they think they do, just that we don't maybe label it as seaweed.
Yeah, I saw that in Brittany they've even got a kind of museum called La Maison des Algues, where you can go along and learn more about seaweed. But is all seaweed edible? I talked about stepping over it on the beach, and certainly on the coast of Wales, you see it there a lot, and you don't really kind of think, let's eat some of that. But is all seaweed, Anna, is all of it basically edible?
No, it isn't. You have to look at the specific species, but there are many that are edible. That's to be said, and I'm sure Simon Lawson knows a lot more about the specific seaweed types like sugar kelp, for example. But yeah, there is a growing interest in these edible seaweed definitely coming up.
Simon, could you literally go and harvest some on the beach if you knew what you were looking for, a bit like picking mushrooms in the forest?
Yeah, I would say also even more in seaweed. At least in Sweden, all the seaweeds are edible, but it depends a little bit on country where it's grown and located. Not all seaweeds are, what do you say, farmable in that sense, where you can plant on ropes, which we do. But if you just dive down and cut some seaweed and take it up, I'd say the chances are that they are edible. But it's of course always good to look up what kind of seaweed it is and what you can do with it and how much you can eat of it.
When you created Nordic Sea Farm, what was the original idea that was behind you? What was the motivation?
So Nordic Sea Farm is founded by marine biologists. So I joined technically later than the company was founded, but I was part of really creating the commercialization of Nordic Sea Farm. And the idea was to really see the environmental effects of large-scale seaweed farming. So it was University of Gothenburg and KTH from Sweden that looked to Asia and see what if we did this in Sweden, what kind of both environmental effects can it have, and it can also create a commercial impact and revenue streams and job creation in coastal communities in Sweden, since the fishing has quite gone down, and the effects were what the research showed that it's very positive effects, that it absorbs excess nutrients from the water and also promotes local biodiversity. And it
Tell
actually
me a bit
grew.
more about that then. Is seaweed kind of even your farm, is that home to lots of other stuff?
Yeah, so it does at first absorbs excess nutrients, carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen. So it kind of promotes eutrophication or mitigates eutrophication, to be said. And also they can see that it increases local biodiversity around the farms. It creates life for small fishes and habitats for other organisms, which is very positive because unfortunately we see otherwise the opposite happening in our coastal areas, at least around Sweden and Northern Europe.
And can you describe what it actually looks like? Because I've seen fish farms, but I don't think I've ever seen a seaweed farm.
So a seaweed farm is if you just take the minimal or the MVP, if you so say, the minimum viable product, it's just one long rope, about 100 meters, which is connected with anchors and some buoys that lies about 1 meter below the surface. So that is in practice a seaweed farm, just one long line of rope. And then you can just add more ropes. And right now we farm from on about 8 hectares, which is maybe 4 soccer fields or so in the ocean,
Okay.
and it's a lot of ropes. Then I'm not sure exactly how many. I think it's a couple of hundred ropes that lies then in the ocean.
Is it a kind of relatively easy to do then?
Yeah, it's quite actually quite easy. The technical part of it, of course, it's taken some research and some team years to optimize the harvest and so on. But it's a quite cheap method still. It's rope and then of course seaweed babies that we plant and glue on the ropes to make it grow. But to just add one more line, it's not that what do you say, capital intensive if you compare it to a fish farm, for example, with the
Mm.
nets and all the fish and so on.
Anna, why aren't there farms like this everywhere where there's a spare bit of space on the sea? Because it sounds like it's pretty easy. You can probably build a business around it.
Yes, I mean that's really the benefit of these things, that you have a low kind of entrance level for this when it comes to cost, when it comes to knowledge. Also, very good when you think about the transition that is needed towards more low impact, small scale fisheries. It's a good question of the why. I mean, we often envision the sea as a space that is, endless, infinite. But that's not the case. In Europe, actually, we are quite packed. We have a number of different players there in the field when it comes to offshore wind, to gas extraction, oil drilling, shipping, fishing. There are so many users, so it's not as easy to say, oh, there's so much space, let's do it. More often. And also, it really, I mean, you want to ideally keep these farms close to the coast. You have a lot
Mm.
more nutrient import there that these algae farms and seaweed farms can use. There's also potential to go a bit more offshore, of course, in different areas. But yeah, you have a bit the problem of, as I said, nutrient levels that are a bit lower as you go more offshore. And of course, you have to do more maintenance. As closer as you are to the coast, it's easier for the farmers to harvest all these things. While when you go a bit more offshore, of course, you need a boat, you need to get there, you need to do the maintenance work.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But Simon, you talked about eutrophication. Can you talk to us a bit more about that? Explain what it is, but also how the seaweed farms are helping with that.
Yeah, so I think a lot comes from the practices we use on land when it comes to agriculture, and how excess nutrients, especially phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon, is getting sipped out into the oceans, creating eutrophication and acidification of that. So that is a problem that's well documented. And seaweed grows, of course, from nutrients. So having excess nutrients or slightly excess nutrients, it's actually very good for the seaweed, because it can grow faster, taking up the nutrients and getting the sunlight to make it grow. And thus, when you harvest it, you then remove that excess nutrients from the ocean. Then it's always a matter of fact, how long is that stored? For example, is it in food, for example, then it will be released maybe in half a year to a year. So then it's maybe a year of sequestration. But if it goes into other segments like materials or even biochar, which it's tested right now, then it can be stored for a much longer time, thus being a carbon sink and creating impact more long term than short term.
It does sound like utterly marvellous stuff, and I absolutely loved reading about seaweed, getting ready for this episode. Just talk us through a little bit, Anna, maybe some of the things you can do with seaweed in terms of eating it, for example, kind of how it's prepared, what's being done, what can it replace? Because I've seen things that look an awful lot like tuna that are actually made out of seaweed. I've seen things that look a lot like smoked salmon that are made out of seaweed, etc. What can we do with it?
I mean, first of all, the easiest way to eat it, I guess, is just eating the seaweed as the plant as it is, and to not process it further. But you can really create some wonderful dishes with it. There's also
tell me about some of the wonderful dishes you can make with it.
I really love seaweed salad, to be honest. I think that's the most baseline easy thing. It tastes great. Especially if you are into this kind of a bit marine, fishy, salty taste. I mean, this is the perfect way to replace seafood products, or like fish or salmon or whatever you have. But there's also a lot of growing interest in these kind of alternatives, plant-based meat and fish alternatives. They are growing quite quickly, and I'm really amazed how they can really get to a similar taste of, for example, seafood and salmon and fish. And I feel like they are really getting better every year as I follow it a bit. So there's a lot of potential there in kind of imitating the taste of seafood as we know it, just because you have that salty marine kind of taste. And I mean, there's also, next to macroalgae, there's also microalgae, but both you can put into powder form, and you can basically do anything with it at the end, and have great nutritional values from it.
I was going to say, nutrition-wise, what's in it? Is it full of protein? Is it what's it? Simon, what's in it?
It does also depends on the species. Very short, high level. There are three groups of seaweed. It's brown seaweed, it's green seaweed, and red seaweeds. The brown ones are the big ones that you can see also in the ocean. They're quite big in carbohydrates and fiber, and usually a good source also for flavor, packed with umami, used a lot in ramen dishes and so on. Not that high in protein. It's maybe 10%, so like pasta or so. But the green seaweeds, we grow sea lettuce, for example. That's quite high in protein. It's 30% in dry matter, and that was the one that was used also on the Nobel Prize dinner. It's a bit milder in taste, so it can be used in a bit broader application areas. Then we have the red seaweeds, typically also quite high in proteins, at least the ones that we farm in Europe, like the dulse. It's also called the ocean's bacon because it gives away a smoky flavor when you fry it. Which is quite interesting. But it also depends. But I think a big market also to mention that is also the alginate market, which is seaweed that you typically not farm, but you just harvest wild. and it goes into alginates such as thickening, emulsifiers, mainly for food, but also for, take a compete plaster, for example, and what's squishy, that usually comes from alginates from brown seaweeds.
And at the moment, for example, I can go up the road to the supermarket and buy myself some something wrapped that's got some seaweed wrapped around it, right? Some kind of sushi type thing, probably a French version of it. But anyway, that stuff, that's not coming from Europe, is it, at the moment? I'm guessing that stuff, when I go and buy some kind of, processed instant sushi thing in the supermarket, that's probably coming from Asia, is it?
Yes, that's most likely coming from Asia. The two biggest countries are China and Indonesia, standing for over 85% of global supply. And I think, of course, price is the matters for these kind of products. But I think long term, we see a trend that more and more both people and countries want to source more local. And then I think European seafood can play a pivotal role. But right now also the supply is quite low, as Anna mentioned before. It's quite decentralized with, in comparison to Asia, small farmers in Europe. So I think we also need to grow these farms to get better scale economics and offer more competitive prices to be able to compete even more with Asian producers.
We'll get to that and how we can try and stimulate that growth. But let's talk a bit more about the health benefits, because it's got vitamins in there, iodine as well, right? Which is good for you. Anna, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. So I think a lot of the discussion, algae has, Simon said, vitamin C, K, you have iodine, you have iron in some species. But I think the main factor that is really interesting, especially if we look at European consumption behaviors, is omega-3. I think there is a lot of hype around eating seafood products to get your omega-3 level up, because it's supposed to be good for your eyes, for your brain. It's very much recommended also by governments. While a lot of people don't really know about it, I guess, that omega-3 is not built by the fish themselves, but they get the omega-3 by eating algae. So in the worst case, you have a scenario where you eat your farmed aquaculture, salmon, burger or whatever. And the kind of the line, of course, is that you have algae that is eaten then by a wild fish, basically, that often is then caught, often in a very destructive way by bottom trawling, for example, releasing a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, which is then, and this is really ironically, fed to another fish, which is the aquaculture fish. So we have a lot of wild caught fish that just gets into feeding to aquaculture fish that then we eat to get our omega-3. So for me, it's a no-brainer to say, okay, if we can skip all these impact lines, and it's not only environmental impact, it also has a lot of social impacts when it comes to injustice, human trafficking, and so on. And if we are going for the nutritional value, why don't we just eat the algae directly, right?
For sure. I mean, that story needs to be told, and it sounds surprising to hear that. I'm thinking about, though, there has to be a downside. Could you get to the point where you're eating it too much, where in fact it's not very good for you?
Are you referring to me or Simon?
Well, either of you can have a go answering that one. Well, Simon, you eat it all the time.
Yeah, but I can start. I think eating basically anything in excess is not good for you, right? So it also depends on what kind of levels are in it. For example, if you take sea lettuce, that is not very high in any subjects, whereas if you take sugar kelp, it's a bit higher in iodine, which is good because you sometimes add that to salt, right? But if you eat too much and in excess of it, that can affect your body in a negative way. So I think it's crucial.
It's good for your thyroid gland, right? Your thyroid.
Yes, exactly.
Thyroid, yeah.
So I think it's always good to look at the national health recommendations to see how much can you eat of it, as you should do with any food, I would say. So I think it's more about normalizing seaweed and doing and comparing it with other foods.
But hasn't it got things like heavy metals and stuff like that in it as well?
I'm glad you asked, because seaweed actually contains less heavy metals than rice, at least the ones we farm in Northern Europe. So most foods actually contain some kind of heavy metals, but when you say that it's lower than rice, which it is in heavy metals, then you think how much rice do you eat, and do you eat more rice than seaweed? Yes,
I
probably.
certainly eat a lot more rice than seaweed, yes.
So I would say
Yes,
it's not a problem there, but thus you should always look at the national guidelines as you do with all foods.
And if I may come in here, I mean, as Simon said, it really is about the quantity. And if you look, for example, at iodine, of course, you shouldn't eat like mountains of seaweed, but it also depends on the species. But in fact, for example, if we look at our current seafood consumption, and there are health recommendations out of what is really healthy for your body. And it goes for about like 2 to 3 portions of seafood per week per person. We in Europe, we are totally over consuming. We are above any health recommendations. For example, the World Health Organization has a recommendation of 15 kilograms of seafood per person per year. And we are way above. In Europe, we have an average of 24 kilograms.
Really?
So I think it's rather a matter of reducing our consumption a bit. And then, as I said, if we are going for the nutritional values, go to low impact food like algae instead. But yeah, I think there is always a top line, of course, of what is too much and how much do we really need. And I think it's good to know that we are already over consuming.
Let's move on to the EU, the policy and support, the framework that you've got as a farmer, actually, Simon. I'm interested in that because I get a very strong impression that at the European Commission and elsewhere in Brussels, they would really like to see that seaweed economy grow in Europe. There's investment going in there. There's research going into it. There are conferences that happen. Are you, as a seaweed farmer, getting the support that you need, the kind of legal frameworks, etc., and the investments to actually grow?
I think it's really been building up the last couple of years. And I think in 2022, they launched an initiative for algae with 20 identified critical points, how we really can support the European blue bioeconomy, where seaweed is a large part. Thus saying it's still a new area, and I think they're still navigating what can really benefit farmers. Is it permits out there? Is it processing facilities and connection to networks? And also the general, adoption of seaweed market-wise. But so far, I think we'll be getting good support. But obviously, we'd like to see even more bets on the investment side, because it is a big when you're going to go and scale up, especially compared to Asian producers. And if we are to compete with those, then we need to build up that infrastructure, both in the ocean and also on land.
Where would you say you most need support now?
Right now, I would say it's actually in the middle segment. I think we cracked the code both in the lab R&D work, which Nordic Sea Farm has worked with a long time ago, and also we have more companies in Europe that has done that. The farming side and upscaling is on its way, but one bottleneck is also the processing, how you can process it into value-adding applications. If you take land, for example, you can take pea protein, for example, and how you can just extract the protein from that. I believe we need to do the same with seaweed to make it even more applicable into as an ingredient into various food sources.
What would be the kinds of incentives that would improve that situation then? Do you think at the end of the day it's a market pull that's going to change that?
I think a market pull is always needed. I think you cannot just push anything out and believe that the customer will be ready to buy. So we spend quite a lot of time working with larger corporates, but it's also a bit of a dilemma, because you also have to be big enough to be able to deliver to the large corporations and customers, right? So I think we need to go from both ways, kind of incentivize large scale farming so we can be competitive in price and quality, and also to work even closer to these actors to do maybe smaller scale pilots and work with small and medium sized customer first, which is our focus right now. But I think this middle stage, when it comes to like biorefineries and so on, to really process large amount of seaweed, is one thing that we'll see a lot of, I think, in the coming years.
Anna, the EU just added 20 algae species to its EU novel food status catalogue in February. That happened. Is that kind of thing significant? It basically means that some new species can be sold, I think.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think that's a really good step into the right direction, and it shows that the EU is really willing to do something. And I think it's a win on both sides, producers and consumers, because you can diversify the field a bit more as soon as you have more species. But also with that novel food regulation in place, it makes it, and adding these species, it makes it a lot easier, because previously you had to do a pre-market authorization for every new kind of species you want to have, and now adding these species, I think, yeah, kind of gets a bit of a shortcut. But of course, yeah, it's not enough, and the EU has to get into some speed. The regulatory framework is very fragmented at the moment. There is so many regulations involved. If you want to do seaweed farming, it's not really included in current national maritime spatial plans. So there are a lot of hurdles, and I think, yeah, as Simon says, also the infrastructure is not really there yet. So we need some incentives from the market side, of course, as well. But I think we also, and the EU Commission is working on that, we need kind of a bit of a guidance for seaweed farmer to really yeah, have a bit of a guideline of how to farm in which areas of the seas, and what are problems, and how can you tackle them, taking farmers a bit more by the hand and say, you can do this, and we are there, and there are incentives, and it's a good thing.
I was going to say to Simon, are there other entrepreneurs getting into the business at the moment? It sounds like the field is open. Actually, the encouragement is there. Probably the maritime spatial planning will come and the permitting will come. If you want to get into this business, is it a good time, actually?
Yeah, I would say so. I think it's really getting more and more traction every year. I think not just being biased and looking at the Seaweed news, I do see it's being out there more and more and more products are being created. And as Anne said, I think more brands are also requesting seaweed, especially in the plant-based sector. And they
How
want
do you kind of differentiate your product, though, to the mass-produced stuff that, as you said, it's coming at a lower price from China or Indonesia? How do you differentiate your product?
It also depends on the brands you work with. We started off in the food service sector, working a lot with restaurants and hotel chains, where they really want to highlight that it's grown locally, it comes from Sweden or Europe, etc. You can tell a story. And we see that more, would say, recently established brands want to do the same when it comes to, for example, a plant-based tuna, a plant-based salmon, but also other kind of brands. I think
So
having
positioning
fewer.
it as a kind of a, if you want to be, responsible towards the environment, high health, very positive in terms of health, etc. Kind of positioning it as quite a upmarket product. Then is that what you're talking
Yes,
about?
we see also a trend that you want to have an understandable backside of the package, meaning that
Yeah.
fewer ingredients and more responsibly sourced ingredients are getting more popular. You don't want to have a 50 ingredient list and a lot of e subjects, right?
No, so
Uh,
I'm thinking one of those packets where we get a smiling photo of you holding up some seaweed standing to next some sort of wonderful Nordic coastline. It's that kind of product then that we're talking about, is it?
yeah, but I think it's also that it's sourced from what do you say, from Europe, sourced from Sweden, sourced from a local producer, and not just only in food, but in other application areas for seaweed also, because there are more than food that's out there.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that actually. Seaweed isn't just food. You can do lots of other stuff with it too. You can make biofuel out of it. You can make all kinds of additives for pharmaceuticals and for cosmetics and things like that. And is that something where we could expect some growth in Europe as well?
Definitely, I can start, and I think, and you
Yeah.
can also
Yes.
fill in. But I think we see a lot of brands. Biomaterials is one actually really exciting area. We see Notpla, for example, which is a UK-based brand that is a lot of capsules and so on and coatings from seaweed. And we say Sway in the US that also does thin films from seaweed, which is biodegradable. And I think we will see a lot more of that, and they all need responsible sourcing, right? And that is something that we will see much more in the value chain coming forward.
Anna?
Yes, exactly. So there's definitely an expected growing demand on majority of fields. Like you can do so many things with seaweed, like pharmaceuticals or biofuel or whatever. I think at the end, I mean, you have to have a look what really makes sense. I mean, this is a really treasurable resource that you have there. And ideally, you want to use it for food, to really feed people, to tackle some of the global issues we have, to tackle some of the issues we have with our current very malfunctioning seafood system of wild caught and aquaculture. There is, especially in the recent years, there was a lot of interest in biofuel. I have the feeling it's gone down a bit. And I have to say, I'm glad about it, because if you take a closer look at these kind of things with biofuels, for example, you see that it kind of has the same problems as biofuel from land crop. It's not really efficient. You have a lot more energy intake than you get out. And it's also, if you look at how plants work and how plants do photosynthesis and convert sunlight into energy, you can see it's not really effective. It's not as effective as if you do, for example, renewables with solar plants, for example, or wind energy and so on. So for me, there is a bit of a worry that these kind of processes, while it's nice ideas, of course, hinder a bit the transition in other fields that we need towards renewables, for
But the
example.
kind of replacement into plastics, perhaps, it could be of interest. I mean, Simon was talking about films that, that when there's so much packaging out there that you see in the supermarket, that has to be replaced by something sustainable eventually. Could seaweed be the solution?
I mean, I don't see seaweed, overall speaking, as the silver bullet for anything. I think it can replace some parts of the destructive system that we have. Of course, it's much nicer if you have seaweed plastic that decomposes than, real plastic then that is in the ocean for years. But on the other hand, it doesn't really tackle the root causes. And that is really our consumption behavior. But instead, it gives a bit of the incentive to consume even more. So for me, it's a question: do I have then a seaweed packaging out of seaweed plastic, or do I just bring my own bag every time and change my consumption behavior? And I think this is true for a lot of areas where it comes to
That's a big shift, though,
overconsumption.
isn't it? Getting to the point where the consumer has their sort of seaweed bag with them, ready to go and pick up their seaweed. Good luck getting that one to happen. I mean, I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but it's not going to happen next week. But I suppose some of the bottlenecks we were talking about, but bottlenecks are to do with a general adoption of this product as a kind of an acceptable product that you can be doing things with. And that, behind that, is even awareness of it as a product. I mean, we're talking about it on this podcast, but Simon, do you meet a lot of people who just look at you blankly when you say you're a seaweed farmer?
Yeah, some it also depends. I think some are more, what do say, well read and really into it than you anticipate. And I would say 98% are super positive when we speak about it. And some people is like, wow, seaweed, that's something else when you swim in the ocean, right? But we receive a lot of positive feedback, both from local communities when we tell what we do, but also when you are out there with the product innovators and they see that we need to make the shift. I think plastic is already on the way out the door. Wood-based products is also under threat because we use too much of it, right now, also with the e-commerce and so on.
Yeah.
So I think seaweed would really it really needs to happen, but it also needs a good product innovation because the function needs to be there, right? If you have a seaweed bag, for example, it still has to have the functional properties of a real bag, right?
Yep.
Not have a smell, for example, and you can modify that, and it will happen. But it's our job to make that acceleration and shift much faster than it's happening today.
Do you think it fundamentally needs rebranding somehow? That actually, at the end of the day, this is possibly about marketing.
Maybe, perhaps, but I don't think so. I think still seaweed has quite a positive, what do I say, tone. I think there are more seaweed out there than you believe. I think also IKEA actually has some seaweed in some boxes. You have the seaweed pearls you eat instead of caviar roe and so on. But perhaps you need to brand it depending on application. Maybe in bioplastics you should frame it some other like ocean materials or something like that. But just to pinch in also, I think that from the supply side we see that seaweed can be used for many different things, also depending on when you harvest. So you have kind of an A harvest, a B harvest, and a C harvest. So the first harvest can go to food because that's the top quality that you actually need to consume. But the longer you wait, the bigger yield you get, but also the lower food grade you get. And that seaweed can then be used for biomaterials. So you can say you have two different harvests. One is food grade and one is not food grade. But then you can also have it's okay to have a different cost base for those because
So in the same way that a vegetable is kind of really nice when it's just become kind of adult, I suppose, and is able to be eaten, but then it sometimes gets a bit tough as it gets older.
yeah.
It's the same with seaweed.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of companies want the rest streams also that we see because they want the mainstream maybe go to food or maybe feed for animals and it promotes gut health. But I think we'll see a lot of upcycling and side streams that will also be part of the branding story, right? That you want to have it as a side stream because then you know it's not used for anything that could have provided more value, if you know what I
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think that's a trend that we'll see in many industries and also seaweed. We're in pilot projects right now where that is a use case.
Anna, what do you think about my question relating to rebranding? Does it need a kind of a makeover?
I think actually it does. Not maybe it's not so much about a makeover completely, but I think it's a lot about awareness raising. I think a lot of consumers, on the consumer side speaking, don't know actually, as I said, about the nutritional values. As Simon also said, it can replace a lot of feed for livestock farming, for example, in aquaculture or with cattle that has a lot of positive impact. But on the other hand, I think it's also a problem that people don't yet understand why do we even have to do a transition from somewhere, from a system that is not working to somewhere else. I think here lies a bit the problem that many people just don't know how impactful their seafood consumption is, not only on the environment, but also when it comes to terms that Europe is really right now eating away food from other countries that depend on it. So I think if there's more awareness raising about these kind of impacts in the first place, and then showing that, okay, here, have a look, seaweed can be a replacement. And here it's very important to say that, of course, we want to avoid a system where the seaweed consumption comes on top of the existing consumption patterns that we have when it comes to wild catch and aquaculture consumption, because then, as nice as it is, it will, inevitably add more pressure to our system, but it really needs to replace some of these destructive elements of our system. And I think then it can be a great story to tell, also for a number of products.
That's an interesting transition, and that argument is difficult to make. But thank you for coming on the podcast and talking about it, because I think it's right. You need to be upfront with people about the overconsumption, about the stresses on the ecosystems, and to say, look, this is a possible alternative. Exactly how you go about making that a story that sells, I don't quite know. But do you think we will? What are the things you'd like to see, Anna, to get us to the point where seaweed is kind of automatically seen as a choice on the menu?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's, as always, a systemic transition. There will be more farmers now who will get into that seaweed farming game. I think then a lot of more marketing and awareness raising will also come from these companies. What I wish to see is that we stay, because we talked a lot about upscaling, and upscaling is really one of my biggest concerns, is that we can keep it or transform it to a new system that is also ideally really stays low impact and is small scale and really contributes to coastal communities and livelihoods of people, rather than recreating a system that we already have, where big corporations come into play, where we have a political economy that is very centralized and becomes probably a big player in the food system, like we can see it now with seafood, but also agriculture problems that we have. So for me, ideally, in an utopia, we create a system that really stays small scale and low impact and decentralized, with local value chains, and really appreciating this as a food and appreciating it as a great source for nutrition that can really feed people without having a lot of the impacts that we have currently with our system.
So just as I might buy local cheese from my local dairy farm, then I also might buy local seaweed from my local seaweed farm.
Exactly. That's the goal.
Yeah. Simon, how do you see the development? It's interesting, the warning, I suppose, we have there from Anna about becoming too big, but on another level, we want it to grow.
Yeah, so I think both are needed in that sense, that you both need small-scale farmers that can supply maybe to a more central unit. That's one thing that you do in the US. Thus, you also get more scale economics. If you have a large farm with a larger vessel, you can farm more at once and so on and get a better price. So I think both will be needed, and I think both are part of our model to farm to a certain extent, large scale and offshore, but also to source in from local farmers to really enable living coastal communities, because we're a strong believer in that.
May I ask a question to Simon, maybe?
Go on.
I would be very interested to hear how you farm specifically, because one of the problems really, I think, and that's one of the issues where we might tap into the same mistakes as been happening already in Asia or also on the land side, is about monocultures. And I think in my dream system, we also have a bit of marine permaculture. We avoid having so much disease spread. We combine it with different other uses of the sea, like wind farms, but also mussel farming, for example. Is this kind of something you are approaching?
Yes, we're actually doing both. So one, we're collaborating with offshore wind farm at OX2 outside of Varberg in Sweden. So they have a 1,000-hectare license, and they also want to utilize co-creation in their wind parks. That's going to be deployed in 2027, 2028, which we're very excited about. But also these kind of IMTA solutions with mussels and oysters. And the fun part is that they can actually help each other by sending out not excess nutrients, but they actually have some kind of biological defense. It's what I've been told, that is increased when you farm them together. And we believe that will be even better to both avoid monoculture and just doing more of one thing then.
Well, thank you, Simon. I look forward to seeing more seaweed on the menu all around Europe because, as you say, it's pretty tasty and it's very good for you. So thanks very much to Simon Johansson, CEO of Nordic Sea Farm, for being with us on Ocean Calls. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
And Anne Seeler, a Marine Policy Officer at Seas at Risk. Fantastic to have you on the podcast.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much for watching on YouTube, and you can listen to more episodes of Ocean Calls on Euronews.com. Is that all right?
Great job.
All right.